All right, everybody, let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll keep talking about how we're going to make connections between sexuality and class for this chapter 4. Okay, so when we talk about sexuality capitalism, we're going to talk about how labor is really tied to family purpose and structure. So for a lot of history, and even in still today in some places, having a family and making it a large multi-generational family and having a lot of kids within that family helps you to create that need for labor within like small structures. So say you had a farm, say you were working that land, you were going to need more bodies to do that. So having that multi-generational family or having that ability to have lots of kids to help you do that became part of that structure. Well, part of what capitalism did was create space for those nuclear families and really drive that idea of nuclear families needing to be financially on their own, needing to be structured and buy all these different things separately as just nuclear units. And it allowed LGBTQ plus people more space to be considered family, more space to be able to have those social interactions because, and to have that validated, because that idea of family wasn't centered around reproduction for labor for family units. Now, to an extent, labor is still tied to that reproduction. We still need to keep making workers in order for capitalism to work, which is going to be interesting moving into the next several generations, which are having kids at a much, much lower rate. So we'll have to see kind of how that ends up playing out and what ideas those elite capitalists at the top are going to have to create in order to restructure us back into making multiple workers in order to create and maintain that viability pool in order to keep doing what they're doing now. And then really talking about how community is shaped differently. So community is going to be shaped based on, again, this idea that if you're not in a nuclear family setting or a nuclear family setting isn't going to financially be possible for you in order to make it within this structure at the prices in which they're currently at, what kind of community can you build, can you make in order to allow for those structures to still have access, I guess, to those same resources, those same lifestyles. And that's going to make a different kind of community building. And then we're going to talk into this idea of commodity fetishism, which is really giving items meaning. And so Marx really talked about this in the idea of we are going to give stuff lots of power. And by power and meaning, they're going to be like, say, that diamond engagement ring. Diamonds are not necessarily rare. They're not necessarily worth the amount that necessarily they're getting paid for. But we pay for that meaning when we're buying that diamond ring. Or we pay for that meaning when we're buying those designer jeans over the $15 Walmart ones, right? And those items and those labels that we associate to them then carry meaning in ways that can be counterproductive to creating equality and structure within a society. And then what we do on top of that is not only create meaning and create price and value on specific like made items, but we also do that on the commodification of sexuality and bodies. And so then like when you think of Pride Month and all of the merchandise that comes out specifically geared towards Pride Month, all the rainbow stuff, everything in rainbows. We got to do the rainbows everywhere, right? Well, that's coming out of this idea that we can commodify not only that item, but we can commodify your identity to a point where we are going to make money off of it during the capitalist structure. And they do that also with bodies, because we're going to commodify bodies as we start to talk about sex work, as we start to talk about how sexuality is played into this idea that the human body that in and of itself becomes this item that you can sell, that you can reproduce, that you can make money off of, that you can tie into this capitalist framework. And again, we're going to get into that a whole lot when we do our chapter on the commodification of sex. So I'm not going to like super spend a lot of time on it right this second. But then we're also going to talk about sexuality projected to objects. And so we're going to even talk about the way we feminize, masculinize, or even tie into, like, we're going to queer certain things. So again, you're going to have those tennis shoes, those Chucks specifically, maybe that have rainbows on them. And you're going to know that's tied into queer living, right? Because you've projected a sexuality onto that object. Okay. So Elton John's sunglasses, right? Like, you've projected his sexuality onto those sunglasses. And we've done that throughout time and space in ways that are both meant to commodify those items and sell them to specific people and or to allies of specific people. But they've also done it in ways that has created harmful things. So like a corporation that maybe doesn't want somebody to buy this might queer it in a way that is derogatory. Well, if you buy this, or like when skinny jeans first started coming out for men, right? Okay, those skinny jeans were going to indicate your sexuality, and they weren't going to do it in a way that benefited you in a social circle. Now, that's not necessarily the case now, but that's not how it originally operated. And driving and projecting sexuality onto those objects allowed for that control, that social control of whatever messaging there was to either buy it or not buy it at that moment. And so we're going to move to the next thing. So colonialism, capitalism, and class. So this is a big one. So colonialism is the political, physical, cultural, religious, or linguistic domination of one cultural group of people by another with the intention of stealing both their resources and the land by any means necessary. And so when we talk about colonialism, we often talk about Africa because Africa was really where, and it's maintained over the course of European history, was one of the more desirable areas to colonialize for multiple reasons. A, it gave them cheap labor. By cheap labor, I mean they enslaved people and made them do the labor for them. It allowed resources. There was an abundance of resources, whether that came down to mineral resources, whether that came down to water, whether that came down to trees, whether that came down to coastal ports, whether that came down to land. Almost all of the main core resources, when it comes down to physical components, happened over the course of the geography of Africa, somewhere on that continent. And so what ended up happening is this mass colonialization of these areas. And in doing so, the cultural, religious, and linguistic annihilation of massive amounts of cultures and people. And that's why we really talk about this in linked to genocide. In so many ways, this also happened within North America. When we came over and colonized as Europeans this country and this continent, we did so through the mass genocide of entire populations of indigenous persons. And that continues to play a link in how we have historically described labor markets and the structure of class within this country. On that note, we also, as white Europeans, came and enslaved millions of Black people, and essentially where we annihilated cultures, we did so through the forced assimilation of slaves to Christianity, to linguistical patterns, to religious and cultural ideologies. but also by annihilating their bodies as labor producers, specifically for capitalist greed and desire to hold specific capitalist resources, including money and power. And that also has had a history and legacy of consistent hierarchical social status, where when you intersect race and class, there has been a generational gap that has never been made up for the amount of capital and space and resource hoarding that European colonialists did in order to become the highest rung on that hierarchical structure. And again, we're gonna tie all of this back into all that intersectionality a lot. But this piece is incredibly important, because without colonialism, capitalism doesn't exist. Without that ability to go and find physical bodies and physical resources that they did not have in the places that they were currently operating, they cannot keep doing what they are doing. So without the continued use of land, property, resources, and bodies that are part of this colonialist process, capitalism cannot function. That specific economic pattern cannot function. And that's important to understand. It's also important to understand how this is linked to the idea of land as property, of ownership, and of resource hoarding. So where capitalism met cultures that believed that in balance within the earth, or they believed in that they did not specifically own rights to any particular piece of land or property, capitalism brought on this desire to resource hoard, or this need to maintain the physical things that they had in order to keep reproducing the products and keep control of that means of production. Well, the cultures that currently existed in those spaces did not have that same inherent ideology. And without that inherent ideology, they didn't make ownership to those lands, because they can't, because that's not part of their cultural ideology. And so instead, colonialists came and said, well, we have the right to this property because we made this our property, and look at the processes we had to do this. You don't have these processes, so obviously this is ours. And that's not how it works. But that's how they made it work in order to keep that capitalist structure and keep putting money in their pockets. We also need to talk about how heteropatriarchy ties into this. So this patriarchal system was really geared towards this idea of, again, this nuclear family. And within that nuclear family, there was male, female, kids, period, boom, done, right? And that tied into how this structures were going to work. If you had a culture that was more based on multi-generational households, right, then you didn't fit the mold of what capitalism was driving, because then not enough of you were buying out all of these different products like housing, and you didn't need all of these different resources, which meant that there was less need for those things, which meant they could make less money off of those things. So in order to break those things apart, there had to be cultural deterioration, because those ideologies didn't fit into this mass buying equation that they were making, right? And then again, there is a consistent amount of cultural variation that does not include capitalism still thriving. Well, not necessarily thriving, but still part of this massive global band of cultures. Okay, so we need to understand that while capitalism is the main economic global system, there are still multiple systems that operate on the globe currently. And those cultural variations still very much adhere to the fact that capitalism is not going to work for them, while many forces continue to tell them and keep trying to pry that and make them part of this capitalist structure. by any means necessary. And so this is still happening, and that's something that we need to consistently be aware of. So how class affects sexual behaviors and attitudes. This is a very interesting section. So really what this talked about was how your class structure, your class identity, or where you fell in that hierarchy impacted how you thought and what you thought about sexuality, about what behaviors were appropriate, about what attitudes you were going to have about all these behaviors, and really what you have the ability to have access to, engage in, and or what social sanctions you had if you did so. And so really this started with Kinsey's data. And it really started about the fact that from their point of view, there was not much difference for men depending on class structure, right? There was not a massive adherence to difference on whether or not they found or were engaging in sexual practices and whether or not they enjoyed them. Women, on the other hand, the higher education level they had, and thus the more in the capitalist structure, more economic autonomy they had, the more they found this to be enjoyable, and the more they found this to have more access to their own autonomy within it, which is important to understand. And then as we look through some of the other data, we find some of these key points. We find that the higher the class, the more freedom you have to experiment or be fluid with less stigma. And we call that sexual privilege. And by that, we mean the higher class you have, and really this is going to also intersect with all of your other identities, right? And all the other hierarchies. But the higher class you have, the more option you have to be, as Katy Perry says, to kiss a girl and like it, right? And that really came down to this idea that there's an allotted ability to kind of push social boundaries when you have access to the means to be able to control what those boundaries are. And they also showed that women of lower educational attainment report more, even though they have more same-sex partnerships, they tend to have more social stigma attached to those. And in the lower classes, you also see those same-sex partnerships still take on like butch femme roles that are more likely to be similar to hetero dynamics. And you see that more often in those lower education attainments or those lower financial stability situations as a way of maybe passing into a more societal expectations. In the lower classes, you're going to see more surveillance and conformity for survival and access to resources. So you're going to see a lot of people that are more closeted, that are more not able to necessarily express certain things or certain beliefs or certain behaviors outwardly. And that is due to A, safety, and B, their ability to keep their job, keep the resources they need at the bare minimum, to keep their housing, those kinds of things. And we're going to get into that in chapter 5, all of the negative social consequences that can come with being a marginalized status with sexuality. You're going to see, so just for the purposes of definitions, kinksters are those who are typically engaged in bondage, dominance, submission, and sadomasochism. And when you talk about them, you're going to see a lot more ability. Again, as we talk about sexual behaviors and attitudes, you're going to see a lot more freedom to have and engage in those when you have access to engage in those, when you have resources, including money, to be able to engage in those, or to engage in the places that maybe you can find other people that would engage in those. And so we talked a little bit about doing class previously, but when we talk about our sexuality, we also do class. So like the ability for Ellen DeGeneres to walk out with her wife and to have this big, huge, elaborate wedding, and nobody was going to protest it. Nobody was going to cause grief, right? The ability for her to do that hindered on her social status, whereas a lot of lower class individuals may not have access to that, or may not be able to engage in those same practices or those same celebrations of those same behaviors because they have to do class differently. And that's going to tie into how they do sexuality differently. And then you're also going to see that where you are on that class hierarchy is going to determine kind of your attitudes of whether biology or social influence are what drive sexual practices, desires, the control over, the need for social control over those things, and really whether or not contraceptives are even necessary or useful, or your beliefs on what or who should be using those. All of those things can get tied in, and we can see a class-based differential in those attitudes and beliefs. It influences, and again, we talked about how class kind of influences same-sex relationships, but again, that's going to be how you get to, whether or not you get to walk around, whether or not you are safe to even be out about it, whether or not you're allowed to carry that identity as a prideful thing. Class is going to give you access and opportunities to do things with less social sanctions, and that's across the board. And so when it comes to these same-sex relationships or relationships that are not part of this heteronormativity ideology, you're going to have less space to do those things with the further down economically you go. And then even class played out even in feminist movements, including the lesbian feminist movements, where there was this idea of people needing labor unions and trade jobs in kind of those lower class feminists, lesbian feminists, and in the higher class, they were like, well, no, I want professional jobs and I want to be able to exude all of my class privilege that comes with having that kind of money. They weren't really fighting for the same things, and that caused a lot of rift within the movement. And we're going to see that happens regularly. Class comes into play along with race when it comes to social movements and their what they're actually looking for. And then lastly, we're going to get into kind of space. So when we talk about globalization, we talk about how movements end up happening globally when we experience the world, not just within our own nation, but we look at things and how our forms of communication, especially social media and things of that nature, you have this capacity to communicate and to broaden what specific things look like, including social movements. But it also allows for this exchange of attitudes towards sex and sexual relationships and influence, and how maybe more positive things can happen in a wide variety of areas due to this idea that there's a growing popularity, or there's a growing level of comfort with same-sex populations being part of the conversation, or same-sex marriage. You're going to see that as certain countries that have economic privilege within that global structure start to make changes, those things are going to happen and trickle down that economic ladder globally as well. And so class functions at a global level, at a country level, at a system level as well. And the way that these things entail is that the more influential you have in economic policies globally, the more likely your social influence is to be on other countries that maybe aren't as high on that radar. And so what we saw with like same-sex marriage and things of that nature. Now, the US, despite its massive influence, also has influence in progressing things backwards as well. And we're seeing some of that pushback now. We're also going to see kind of this this more future model of sex work as it changes to a more global market, and how that's going to influence this. And we're going to get more into that again when we get into that commodification of sex chapter. And then we're going to talk about this idea, this global gay identity. So this identity that puts you in this spot as you can recognize me as this because I am globally this idea, and we're going to make this idea pertinent and important and valid in very flashy, big ways. And that's not always a bad thing, right? Because it also gains visibility. And when visibility is lacking, sometimes those things allow that space. On the flip side, it creates the same stereotypes that you often work to get away from. And it allows that same space for critique, for measure, for disconnect, even within other members within your queer community. We're also going to talk about migration, and again, that international migration of people motivated fully or partially by sexuality. So again, those are going to be immigrants and refugees that are specifically moving because of their sexual identity and the safety concerns that they have of having that in the space that they currently operate, and needing to be in a space that will create more safety for them. And then you're going to look at homonationalism, which is an embrace of sexually progressive multicultural justification of foreign intervention. So this is the idea that maybe a culture that is more progressive can influence or intervene in foreign policies in places maybe where it's still punishable by death to be queer, right? That idea that an international community can come together and say, I'm going to intervene in this way because this is now a human rights problem. This is now a problem that creates a human safety or humanitarian crisis. And so those are things that you're going to do this, but all of that's going to be tied to worth. It's going to be tied to this idea of questioning the one party's traditions. It's going to be talking about changing the dynamic between state and whatever that state is, and its relationship with queer persons and queer community and the queering of sexuality. And so in doing that, you're going to see a lot of pushback, a lot of push and pull, and a lot of conflict. And then, so things that they talk about here are those neighborhoods or gay bars. And these are really going to be neighborhoods that were specifically geared towards queer people. And they really came out of this era in port communities where large portions of queer people were dishonorably discharged from military positions. And then they ended up in these cities. So you're going to see them in San Francisco, New Orleans, Chicago, Seattle, New York, such as like the Greenwich Village. There's all these areas. But what you're going to see now is this new hetero gentrification of these areas, where these areas have been specific to a certain queer community for an extended period of time. But now hetero couples and hetero families that want to be immersed in cultural diversity are now gentrifying these neighborhoods in ways that limit their capacity to be queer havens, to be queer safe spaces. And you're seeing a lot across the country. On the flip side, it also is saying that there's a large portion of traditional homo or hetero normative people who are saying that being in these areas is important to them. And so there's push and pull there, and there's negatives and there's pros and cons. But something, as we talk about these places, is still that need for safe spaces still has to exist. And so if we're going to engage in this process of hetero gentrification, we also have to talk about how we keep and maintain safe spaces for the queer community. And in talking about this, and in talking about these spaces and these areas, we can't not talk about Stonewall, right? Stonewall is arguably one of the biggest striving points for the LGBTQ rights movement. And it came from this really big clash with police brutality that was happening at the Stonewall bar, and trans women of color consistently pushing back. And in this particular instance, that pushback became physical, and there was a beer bottle thrown into a group of cops that was harassing and causing a ruckus, and had consistently been harassing the patrons of this bar through not just verbally, but physically, and through sexual violence. And so they'd had enough. And this big riot broke out. By riot, I use that term loosely because really what this was a last-ditch effort of survival. And it created and sparked a movement that we still are fighting today. And so, but it was on the backs of trans women of color that we really got this movement. And so, and that all came down to that Stonewall bar, which was really protecting one of their safe places. And it draws into that idea that safe places are so incredibly vital to marginalized people. And so we really need to make sure that we're maintaining those. And we're also going to talk about how, because of those queer neighborhoods are getting that gentrification and lacking that ability to be affordable for queer persons, you're seeing this suburbanization of sexual minorities, and you're seeing that in a way that they have to move to places outside of the city that are more affordable. And you're seeing that in ways that aren't necessarily always the safest space for them and aren't always the most welcoming space for them, but are lacking economic options that make other places viable. When we talk about rural queer folk, we're really talking about a couple of things. We're talking about invisibility. So we're talking about just straight up being told that these kind of things don't exist. And that includes your terminology, a lacking ability to find people like you, lacking ability to find people that will support you. On top of that, you're going to see this blending of ideologies to where you're pushing boundaries of what it means to be a hetero person and what it means to be heteronormative, so that you can engage in practices that feel better to you, but still maintain that heteronormativity in ways that keep you safe, in ways that communicate to your social world that this is who you are. And so that includes things like what the authors talked about as bud sex, or this idea that men were engaging with sexual practices with other men, but doing so in this in claiming that they weren't doing this in queer ways, and that it required you to only do this with people who also said that they weren't queer, and engage in these practices under this guise of heteronormativity, right? And then it also talks about the fact that rural queer folk are the most of them that are raising kids are doing so in the Midwest, the South, and the mountainous regions. So in the same areas where we're seeing more people choose to continue those traditional patterns of nuclear families and traditional patterns of continuing to have kids, and less of that drop off like you're seeing maybe in those bigger cities where it's not economically feasible to keep reproducing in the same ways that we once did. You're also seeing queer folk continue that same kind of trend. So they might choose to not be parents in areas where economically that's not necessarily the most feasible, or in bigger cities just in general, they may have different ideologies. They may be focused on different parts of their identity, including where they work and things like that. But in these more rural areas, you're seeing more of them create that family dynamic of child rearing, which is interesting. And then you're going to have lesbian utopias, or this idea of the women's land movement. And this was just a part of a branch of the feminist movement that really worked towards getting land, maintaining space, and creating lesbian relationships to disconnect themselves from this heteronormative idea of what the world needed to operate and what their idea of labor division needed to be. And so really this was just, again, moving back to everybody needs to make place, and social media tends to be a place where a lot of that is happening for queer folk. And so while bars and other places might be winding down and might be changing their dynamics, social media has brought this global wide effort and this ability to be seen or be visible and have who you are visible in ways that in a lot of places 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. And so while social media has its downfalls, it's also allowing a lot of visibility for and a lot of accessibility to persons like oneself for sexually marginalized individuals. And that's something, again, we're going to get into as we move forward in the course and we talk about how technology changes things. But that's all for chapter 4. I'm going to go ahead and get off here, and then we will talk through chapter 5 and have a great module. So I hope you're having a great week again, and I look forward to seeing you when we discuss chapter 5.